So here's a very quick video on putting on this epoxy for the bevels on this nutshell pram. We've got the shear plank down there. We've already put on a bead of epoxy, come back along with the magic paint stick and taken the bead and flattened it out to make sure we covered the bevel. And so we've done that to about here. What's the magic bead size? Well, it's about like that, depending on how wide your bevel is for this boat. So we just take the paint stick and go down. See, I missed a little spot there. Come down and spread it out. If you find out you've got big, you do your first plank and you find out you got big beads of blobs of epoxy everywhere, maybe go a little bit lighter the next time. And just keep on going. Try to clean up any excess as you go along. And you can see as it gets on there, whoops, let me get the camera back up where it's supposed to be. That end grain will starting to darken up, so you can kind of look back and see if you see any light spots where maybe it didn't darken. Go back and just touch it up a little bit or flatten it out some. You know, I've got this on the bow transom. It's thicker, 3/4 inch. So I went and I put 2 beads, and I'll just go and flatten that out. Jeff Kerr at Two Daughters Boatworks has a great video on building a Caledonia yawl that you can see all 858 parts episodes of it on Off Center Harbor, I believe. Now there's not that many, and it's a lot of information that we learned about building glued lap strake came from those videos. And he has a technique where he'll go down one side, a little bit of angle up, and then he'll go down the other side, angle up. So he's made sure he's got both sides covered, and there's maybe a little mound in the middle that when you put that plank on and you draw it tight, it'll squeeze that epoxy out either way. And we're talking squeeze out when we put on the plank. See if it'll do it here. And you tighten it down, you want to see a little bit squeeze out. You put it on and you don't see anything like that, and you don't see any epoxy, then you potentially have an epoxy starve joint. And you'd, at a minimum, maybe you want to re-release the plank and put a little more in, or take your caulk gun and come around the top, get the plank loose and put it down the top and go back on it again, so that when you tighten everything up, you see a little bit of squeeze out. And what we like to do is we like to let, once that happens, let it sit for a few minutes, and then we'll come back along with the magic gloved finger, just like you do caulk in your bathtub, and clean out excess, because I don't want to come back and see a blob that big on my plank lap. So I want to see something nice and smooth. But we do wait probably 5-10 minutes, depending on how fast the epoxy is tacking up. You want to do it before it gets tacky. And then we've come back in here and we've smoothed that out so that we got this little area here that you can still see the epoxy, but there's not a bunch of ripples or excess blobs, etc. And why are we waiting? Because with this dry wood, some of that epoxy will be sucked back into the joint as the epoxy gets sucked into areas like this end grain right here. This grain right here, it'll get pulled in. So if you've got a little bit of excess on the outside that you still see it, you might come back 5-10 minutes later and see it's gone. In fact, you might even see a tiny little gap, and you probably want to put some more epoxy in there. And you could either, if you have to do that, you can either do it with the tip off the mixing tip, or you could have a small syringe handy that you can inject some epoxy in there, and then inject that down into the seam. Trowel it in with your finger, make sure you got enough in there. Once again, just finding the Goldilocks amount where you got just enough, but not so much that when you come back later and you have to sand, You can see this area right here is dark because there was epoxy on it, but then I came back and wiped it off. And so now it's a smooth surface, but a little bit of the epoxy has soaked into the plywood. So we've got a nice smooth surface. I'm not going to go over bumps and ridges of epoxy when we get done. So it's cooler today, so we can stand around and yap about epoxy for a little bit longer, but on a hot day, you might need to be working a little faster to get this plank on before the epoxy starts tacking up. Usually not so much of an issue with these pre-mixed blends. You can see a little bit better picture of it here. This is the resin with the filler mixed into it in this tube, and then the smaller tubes, the hardener. But if you're working with straight epoxy, some of that will start to fire off pretty fast on a warm day. But it's about 55 in the shed right now, so we got a little bit of time. So we're gonna finish this up and get to work and put this plank on.